Hello, I'm Robert, a fact checker and science blogger and helping people who are scared of many things. And so welcome to my channel. And this time I'm talking about the COVID vaccines and just a little quick view of where you can find out about them all. So there are 10 vaccines that are actually currently being used, that have been approved and licensed for general use by different countries. Only one of them so far by the World Health Organization, but they're gradually working through several others and expect to announce them soon. And these are the different technologies. So the protein base, they just put let's have a look at they've got a summary of the different technologies here. Let's look at it. So the whole virus, and that's you use either live attenuated virus, which is a weakened form of the virus, or you have an inactivated virus, where the genetic material has been destroyed, so they can't replicate, but the rest of the virus is still there, so they can still trigger an immune response. But it's a live attenuated vaccine, like you have for measles, then that's a weakened form of the virus. Then you have the protein subunit, and those are just little bits of protein from the pathogen. And they say hepatitis B as an example, vaccine as an example. They just use tiny bits of the pathogen, often fragments of the protein, but that minimizes the risk of side effects, but means the immune response may be weaker, so they often need to be boosted. Then you've got the nucleic acid ones, which you've probably heard of, which is RNA or DNA, and they instruct the cells to make the antigen, which is, in other words, the bit, in this case, the viral spike protein. In other words, they give instructions to your cell to make the viral spike protein. The instructions don't replicate. So you just have lots of instructions that go into your cells. So you vaccinate someone with lots of instructions, which go into the cells, and then the one set of instructions can make loads and loads of spikes. And then spikes go out of the cell into your bloodstream, into your body, and then your immune system is activated by that and fights the spikes. But the instructions don't replicate, so it's not a virus. The instructions only make the protein spikes. They don't make copies of themselves. And a viral vector is rather similar, and that is where you use something like an adenovirus, as it causes the common cold. And then those also actually work very much like the RNA vaccines, that the common cold has a very similar approach, but it injects DNA, which then produces RNA, which then produces instructions, which would normally be instructions to make an entire new virus, but instead it only makes the protein spikes. So it's the same thing with the viral vectors, and they're only making the protein spikes, and they can't actually replicate themselves, because you've destroyed most of the DNA inside the virus. But you've very cleverly left enough in for the virus to make the protein spikes, but not to make a copy of itself. So that's the viral vector. And then those are the 4 types. So those are the 4 types we've got here. So here we are. So we've got red, that's a protein base. There's just one that just makes the protein. There's 2, which that would be Moderna and Pfizer, which are nucleic acid by either RNA or DNA, and they're both RNA. And then there's the viral vector, and the 3 of those, and that will include AstraZeneca, and those are the ones that work very like the messenger RNA, but they have a 2-stage process where they inject DNA into the nucleus of your cell, which then makes the RNA, and the RNA they make is very similar, and basically the messenger RNA bypasses the bit of injecting DNA into the nucleus of the cell. And then finally you've got the whole inactivated whole virus, and the 4 of those, and those are mainly in China's ones. And so you can look there. I'll put links to all these in the video description. And then this is the another place where you can look, COVID-19 tracker, and this is this one tells you which countries have authorised each one. For instance, these are all the countries that have authorised Pfizer, and that includes the World Health Organization. These are the ones that have authorised Moderna, and World Health Organization hasn't authorised it yet. Now, part of the reason why World Health Organization can come late is because they depend on the vaccine manufacturers to give them the information and data for them to analyse it. And they don't authorise based on preliminary data, they need to have the proper thorough data. And sometimes the vaccine manufacturers have been a little bit late in getting this data to the World Health Organization. And they have been asking in their press briefing, asking vaccine manufacturers to supply them with the data faster so that they can evaluate it faster. And then there's the Sinovac, so they've got the data from China for the Sinovac, so they're going to be evaluating that quickly. And they've got the AstraZeneca, so these will probably be very soon, in the next few days. They'll have another couple from China and the AstraZeneca one. And then there's the Russian one, they've got the Russian one, and that is actually working pretty well. So they're likely to authorise that one quite fast. And, we've had these disappointing results for AstraZeneca for the South African variant. The COVAX is not limited to the ones they've bought so far. And they, for instance, if China does produce good vaccines, then China is probably going to, may well even donate to COVAX and their vaccines, we'll see. And China has had good results, but the World Health Organization will be examining those just now, probably as we speak. So anyway, that's where you can keep track of what stage it has reached of authorization in all the countries. Now, another good one is the New York Times Coronavirus Vaccine Tracker. Wait a minute, I'll just check, because I actually subscribe to New York Times. I'll just check and see if it is available if you're not subscribed. Wait a minute. Okay, yes. So I just brought it up with a new private window, so it hasn't got my subscription information. I subscribe to them and to the Washington Post because in order to help with debugging, because I have to do so much debugging of US stories. Debunking, I mean, not debugging, debunking. I'm forgetting. Yes, I'm a programmer by my day job, as it were. So the coronavirus vaccine tracker, that's very useful, especially if you want to learn how the vaccines work. So if we look at the abandoned ones, they're quite interesting. That the reasons why they're abandoned, so very few have been abandoned. The Imperial College, just because there's so many vaccines around already, are never going to do an RNA vaccine, and they just said, well, we've already got so many vaccines, we're better off making modifications of the ones already there to work with the emerging variants. So they just changed their direction to work with the variants. And then a couple from Merck, and they sadly found they produced a response that's weaker than natural infection. Nearly all the vaccines have a stronger response than natural infection, so that's why they stopped theirs. It probably would have worked. And then a really rather strange one, the University of Queensland, and that was a collapse of $1 billion deal for 51 million doses for the Australian government. And that was a big deal, that one. It's really rather sad. So what happened is that first of all, they had problems with the spike proteins unfolding, and so they had a small change to the protein, creating a little clamp to hold the molecule in its proper shape. But sadly, the clamp turned out to be similar to a protein on HIV. And as a result, people who volunteered for the vaccine trial tested positive on HIV antibody tests, even though they didn't have HIV. So that if they'd rolled that out to the whole of Australia, that would make it very difficult to detect HIV in Australia, because you get all these false positives from people who'd been vaccinated. So that's a really rather sad reason why they had to abandon that one. It didn't give you HIV, it just had a tiny protein in the vaccine, and then your body develops antibodies to HIV. So basically, your body develops antibodies to the disease it doesn't have. And that was why they had to abandon that. Wouldn't have given you HIV, but no harm. The vaccine wasn't harmful in any way. So anyway, so then if you go and look down, if you click on the, now wait a minute, where do you do? Got to find the right page. You've got to go down here, right? So you click on the ones you want to see. So you look at the approved ones, and it'll give you the list of the ones approved. The very interesting thing is it goes and explains all the detail of how they work. And lots of details. By the way, this is a rather amusing thing. The very first person to get to be vaccinated with Pfizer was called William Shakespeare, but of course not the famous playwright. It's just a coincidence. Anyway, if you look at phase 3, and this is phase 3, that's which am I at? Phase 3. And if I search the page for Medicago, this is my favourite vaccine. Really, just because it's very fun, it's really quite useful. Yeah, this is one. It's funded by the cigarette maker. It grows the vaccines in a plant called a wild species related to tobacco. And they deliver the virus genes into the leaves, and then the plant then produces protein shells that mimic the viruses. And then then you can harvest the leaves, and you've got virus. So before that, we have had viruses made in hens' eggs, for instance, and made in animals, and then very often made in human cell lines. But Medicago is making its viruses in tobacco plants, and I think it's the very first, and it's now in phase 3, and it's the very first vaccine to be made in a plant. And so that'll be so when you look at the vaccine. Oh, another thing I should bring up, I haven't listed here for vaccine, is the COVAX. I've just typed dashboard. Yes, the COVAX market dashboard. That's another resource that will tell you all about what's happening in the research in vaccine research development. So I'm hoping that this will help you understand science has moved on tremendously, and we've had these issues with the variants, but there's just so many vaccines. You see all these ones, 10 vaccines, 22, and then if you go and look over here, in preclinical trials, 175, 18, 23, 22, 10. So, and AstraZeneca, it doesn't work really for mild cases of COVID against the South African variant, but other vaccines do. So with so many vaccines, and even if we get these variants and the whole vaccines, then these are likely to work. So the Chinese ones, which are going to be approved quite soon, these are whole virus vaccines, and they're working as well, and they're also turning out to be very safe too. We have yet to see the safety data, but there haven't been any reports of problems. And if the World Health Organization approves, I'm not sure if one of the ones they'll approve next is a whole vaccine, but if it is, those are much more robust to variations in the virus, because there's much more of the virus to trigger antibodies. Instead of just one particular bit, the spike, the entire inactivated virus triggers antibodies. And so it'll take a lot longer for the variants to evolve far enough to not be stopped by antibodies to a whole inactivated vaccine. There's one attenuated vaccine in one of these clinical trials, but they're mainly inactivated. The attenuated ones usually need a longer period of testing. So there are those four. I'm not sure. I think they're all inactivated ones. So those would likely pass through approval quite quickly, and then they will be a big weapon and so China may have kind of struck gold there by going for inactivated vaccines, inactivated viruses for its vaccine. So that may be a very good weapon in against the variants to plug in the gap. While the messenger RNA ones, they have the advantage you can change the spike very quickly, and if you change the spike very quickly, then that means that they can probably very quickly create multi-purpose vaccines that work against multiple variants all in the same vial, with just multiple spikes in the same vial. So they wouldn't just have a new Pfizer vaccine that works against South African variant, but one will work against the UK variant, the old version before any variants, and the South African variant, and whatever other variants have turned up by then. So we have a bit of a hiccup, but the science is science is accelerating at such great speed that we really can keep it under control. It's not likely that the virus can escape us very easily, and then if it does become endemic, and I've talked about how I think we will end up with zero COVID, because it's a one-way process. I can't see a country that's already zero COVID going the other way. So gradually over time, I think more and more of the world is going to join the zero COVID part of the world population, especially since about a fifth of the world population is already there. And especially if we get a big country like India or United States or both, they both go for zero COVID, and then say Germany, then I think that'll start the momentum towards the entire world aiming for that. Anyway, so I was just going to show you the COVAX vaccine market board, vaccine market dashboard. So this is very useful for keeping track of the vaccines. Especially look here at the number of secured vaccines. These are vaccines that the manufacturers have already promised to make. 10.1 billion vaccines. Some of those are single dose, the J&J ones. Even if they're all double dose, that's enough for 5 billion people. And of course, a few percent get lost, get damaged in some way, or people overorder, and that is to say that leaving the factory door 10.1 billion, but a few percent will get lost at the other end, not the fault of the manufacturer. Because, for instance, someone opens a package and then they just can't use up all the doses, and then some of them are spoiled. So you get a few percent of those lost. Then of course you get the manufacturers who overestimate and say, oh well, we can easily supply 10.1 billion, then it turns out it takes a bit longer than they expected. But really, we can expect close to 10 billion vaccinations, then got 3 billion secured for the COVAX facility. I think a few of those they're not going to actually be able to get until really quite late in 2021. But they got about 2 billion really quite quickly. Now we go and look at these different sections here. Look at which one do I want to look at, the capacity, and then the agreements. So wait, there we are, the capacity. So then if you go and look at that, this is the first quarter and the second quarter of 2021, and that I think is 7.2 billion and 10 billion. That they're capable of making 10 billion. So really, in 2021, now this is slightly optimistic. They've warned it could be optimistic. May project a highly optimistic, maybe highly optimistic. But these are projected capacities, and it's like vaccinating the entire world, especially since 20% is already virus free. Many people in China don't really see the point in getting vaccinated because their risk is almost zero. And the government is, China's, even with their recent outbreak like 1,000 people in over a billion, it's still a very small number. And they know how to stop it with other methods. So the priority for the vaccine is the part of the world that isn't vaccinated. But even if you, we probably will have enough for 60% vaccinated, 50% certainly, and probably 60% by the end of 2021. But then we take, for example, the Medicargo I just showed you. Well, that's not included there. That's not in that list. So if that then turns out to be a wonderful way of making a new vaccine, then that'll add to our list by the end of the year. We have other ones. CureVac is, I think, is that in? I don't know if that's in. These are the different ways of making it. No, it's different versions, but I don't think they are including. I don't think we would include Medicargo in that list yet. And then look at the capacity for 2022 and 2023 to about 30 billion. And even if they are dual dose, that's enough for double the world's population. They will have enough vaccines to vaccinate the entire world population, getting on for twice. And then even more in 2023, if it's still needed. And the other very positive thing about all this is that all this is building capacity for countries are now making vaccines that never did before. And they're increasing the capacity to make vaccines. And this increased capacity we have now for making COVID, we can use to make other vaccines. And so in the second half of the 2020s, we're going to have much more availability of vaccines for all sorts of diseases than we have now. And also, for instance, gene sequencing in order to test for the COVID variants, then that is being expanded around the world. Then that's a permanent increase in capabilities. Countries in Africa and so on now able to do gene sequencing and never could before. And then the supply of oxygen, then the actual oxygen generators have been sent to countries in sub-Saharan Africa which used to have to import all their medical oxygen. Now they can produce their own medical oxygen, and this is going to save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, including children, who nowadays, or up to now, have died of pneumonia, preventable deaths, if they only had medical oxygen. And now many countries now have medical oxygen which they didn't have before, and they would only have been able to import it for very rare and difficult cases. Now they have medical oxygen available for anyone who has pneumonia. So we have got a permanent strengthening of the World Health System already as a result of COVID. And the World Health Organization, they're very keen on us maintaining the capability and not losing the capability we've developed. Because of course this will help hugely for any new outbreak. If we had had the capability we have now, at the start of 2020, we could have stopped this much faster, more easily. If we also had this previous experience, it would never have got anywhere. If we'd had the previous experience of SARS that China and Taiwan had, then this pandemic would never have happened. So looking forward, if we have another pandemic like this, and people say, oh, what if it was much more deadly? Well, we've already done that experiment. So SARS has the same reproduction number as COVID, between 2 and 3. It's far more transmissible. It is airborne. Even with good ventilation, SARS is airborne. And one SARS case can infect 22 people in a single plane flight of just 3 hours. COVID can't do that. So SARS is far more deadly than COVID. So when people talk about a much more deadly version of COVID, that's SARS. And so why didn't SARS spread all the way around the world and kill vastly more people? And the reason seems to be because it was so deadly. And if COVID had been as deadly as SARS, we would have stopped it long ago. That seems to be the reason why we haven't stopped COVID. Because the method of stopping it is the same as for SARS. SARS has a shorter incubation period. Perhaps that helps a bit as well with SARS. But we know how to stop COVID. We have known how to stop COVID since January 2020. And if the rest of the world had taken COVID as seriously as SARS, then it would never have got around the world. And the main reason they didn't is because it's less deadly than SARS, and because it's got such a long incubation period, and because it's mild then for such a long time after the incubation period. And so countries just get complacent, and by the time the deaths are increasing, then they've got so many cases in their community that it's quite difficult to stop, and then they still think, it's only a bit more deadly than flu, and it takes a long time for them to realise how bad it is. And that's the only reason that we didn't stop COVID. If it had been as deadly as SARS, we'd have stopped it. So when people start saying, what if we had a disease like COVID but it was as deadly as SARS, the answer is we would have stopped it long ago. So really it's probably not optimal. There probably can be worse disease than COVID, ones that are even more transmissible. But if it's more deadly than COVID, then even if it was very transmissible, we wouldn't let it spread like this. So even if it was, even if it was as transmissible as measles, but it was as deadly as SARS, we'd find a way of stopping it. We wouldn't let it spread around the world. So I think this is almost the worst disease we could have in terms of a pandemic, with modern science, that is. Of course, without modern science, then the Black Death was far, far worse than COVID. But in terms of percentage of the population actually killed by it. But with modern science, this is maybe almost the worst that is possible. Anyway, so the point there is that we can, with the experience from SARS, from COVID, we've all now got this experience around the world, then we are very prepared for future pandemics. And then we have all these tools around the world now. Around the world, we are developing genomic surveillance around the world. It's gradually expanding more and more and more. Around the world, very rapid PCR tests. So if we had something like this again, then by February, they'd be gene sequencing it throughout the world. And they would have PCR tests throughout the world. There wouldn't have been those long delays that some countries had, sending off their swabs to other countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And we also have the experience of this in the ICU care units, and knowing how to ramp up quickly, and the importance of contact tracing. And then they would employ contact tracers very early. So if we were like we are now in January 2020, then they would immediately have done testing throughout and we've got the testing capacity and the capabilities we developed for testing for COVID, we can similarly test for other things. So if we get a new disease, then it'd be much faster, as long as we don't lose that capability, it'd be much faster to be able to test for it in your community. So really, this is our response to COVID is actually greatly strengthening the healthcare, and it's also changed our priorities, the way we think about it. It is before then people didn't really think of health as a priority in the developed world. In the countries with weaker healthcare systems and weak economies, they have been through, and this is one of the things the World Health Organization say, that what we've gone through with COVID, if you were a child brought up in sub-Saharan Africa. This is just the latest of many epidemics you've had, different diseases. And for them, COVID isn't such a big deal because they've been through this many times. And in the developed world, we tend to forget that, how difficult this century has been for people living in the less fortunate countries, where the frequent pandemics like this, epidemics like this, that do get stopped, but they can't do much about it. And then for instance, the many people in Africa with HIV that just are not getting treatment for it, and are dying of HIV with no treatment at all. That just shouldn't happen in the modern world. And the people who are dying of diarrhea, and I don't know, I think that's greatly reduced, but the people who are dying of neotetanus, in other words, tetanus of a child, which is a risk for a child at a very young age. And those deaths are all preventable. We shouldn't have deaths of neotetanus. A child shouldn't die of tetanus. And so gradually this reinforcement of our healthcare systems throughout the world, and this is a thing that's going to make a big difference. And then you talk about cholera going through refugee camps. And Mike Ryan was talking about his experience of working with refugee camps and things like cholera going through the camp, and they being helpless and feeling helpless, much like people have felt at various times during this pandemic. And what's happened? Oh yes, it's still there. Just lost it for some reason. So so that's half an hour. Oh well, I meant this to be short, but anyway, I'll stop this now and upload it.